have Sieva Rodniansky. Sieva is a former Ph.D. in urban planning and development at USC Price, and now he's an assistant professor at Occidental College in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. He's going to be talking about, do NIMBYs vote with their feet when LIHTC comes to town?
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you, everybody. Please let me know if you can't hear me or can't see something. It's very exciting to be back even virtually presenting at USC Price. Lots of fun memories and contact with many of the people on this call continually. So it's very nice. And today I want to talk about a project that started several years ago and is still ongoing about that combines residential mobility, housing, and the way that things get done, planning for affordable housing. So let's talk a little bit about the setting of affordable housing and then how it gets done. So most of you are pretty familiar with LA County, so I'm not gonna belabor these points, but in general, we know that there's high demand for affordable housing here, right? Most, due to high housing prices and a tight housing supply, right? These are not new things. Also, the jurisdiction as a whole and the municipalities within it have a RINA responsibility to the state and to the region for building low-income housing, right? So there's both demand, there's low supply, and there's a regulatory kind of stick. Maybe not a very strong one, but it's there. So one option that they could avail themselves to, whether it's through developers or nonprofits, is the low-income housing tax credit, the LIHTC. Again, most of you are familiar with it. It's one such option. The reason I'm picking the LIHTC for this project is because LIHTC has certain particularities about where and how it gets located, right? There's something called a QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, which says how much LIHTC money is associated with which type of characteristics, geographically, by property type, by resident type. And then in California, there's an additional points system that, that preferences certain high needs areas. It also preferences high cost areas in certain cases and high amenity access areas, right? So you have a variegated landscape of what they want, and they're using this relatively large federal subsidy called LIHTC in order to have some sort of spatial outcomes in addition to just having affordable housing units. Okay, so how about when you're actually getting it done in the nitty-gritty, right? So, and this plays out not just for LIHTC, but you can think about it as any affordable housing development or, perhaps a housing first homelessness situation or anything like that, right? Let's say a new housing development is proposed in a particular neighborhood. It goes to planning, it goes to zoning. There's a relatively long process because it's multifamily. Oftentimes there's local opposition, which we might read about online or, in person or hear about it on our public access, right? And the local opposition tends to argue that they don't want this project in their neighborhood. Sometimes they say they don't want it at all, but oftentimes nowadays they're savvy and they say, this is a great project, just don't make it here. It's too dense for us. It changes the character of the neighborhood. It draws more than its fair share from the services we offer. It might lower property values, et cetera, right? Some of these are veiled discriminatory statements. Some of these are just perhaps their actual views are ignorant, right? So this together is grouped as a NIMBY, not in my backyard type approach, right? This is what we're talking about. Oftentimes, these are wealthier homeowners in the area, sometimes not in the area, but oftentimes in the area. And sometimes they're represented by homeowner associations or groups of homeowner associations. And there's a variety written on this in LA and LA County specific. And, from our kind of real estate and planning perspective, right, this causes a friction. It presents a challenge for developers in getting projects sited and completed. And again, this happens for private developers and for nonprofit developers, right? Neither are spared. This is the setup. So, but let's say through, it goes through this process, it has all this opposition, and then the property actually gets built. What do the NIMBYs do? Do they act in some way, right? Do they engage in, physical property destruction or vandalism? They really don't want it. They're going to destroy it, right? Or, okay, they're not that violent, but are they going to harass the residents? Perhaps they're going to call the cops more often than they would ordinarily, right? they could have a variety of these types of responses if they really care about this issue or this development. One thing they could do is move out of the neighborhood, right? It's distressing. This new affordable housing development next door or a few blocks away is so distressing they might move out. Or do they not care and they just go on to live their lives or to challenge the next development? So I'm interested about whether we can say anything about them moving out. Now, why should we care and why should you all care? I think there's a few practical and theoretical considerations here. So practically, right, we want to know, if there's enough of this move out, does LIHTC change the income composition of a neighborhood? Let's say it used to be 20% higher income. You put enough LIHTC in there, it goes to 0% higher income, right? That is a sociologically and demographically interesting possibility. Another question practically is, how entrenched is the NIMBY and NIMBY type opposition to LIHTC or other things like this, right? Are they only entrenched enough beforehand, or do they actually care about doing something even after the thing gets approved or built? And then also, can any info that I can shed light on improve the siting or planning or approvals process that could make it less, fewer frictions? And theoretically, I think this can shed a little bit light on, is this evidence of Tiebout type sorting, right? Are people moving with their feet because they no longer like the basket of amenities that are in their area? It also talks about, do NIMBYs have are they peddling credible threats, or are they just causing a big ruckus and then moving on to the next project, right? So, if it actually gets built. And then I think a little bit this might shed something on the strength of the home voter, right? Because many of these oppositions are homeowners relative to rental properties, right? So that there is definitely a tenure conflict in here. Okay, so I do believe this is important and it can shed light on both practical and theoretical considerations. Now, how do we do this, right? Is it possible to even measure whether a NIMBY moves from the opening of a nearby affordable housing project, right? So directly, it's tough. I got to say it's tough. It's hard to know who a NIMBY is versus who is just wealthy and or a homeowner, right? And we can talk about this, but I kind of take a slightly more indirect route, and I think it's second best. It's not first best. It's second best, but I think it does push the field forward. So indirectly, you could look at actual neighborhood composition changes, and we're going to do that today. You could also look at whether nearby LIHTC is a mobility push factor for wealthy individuals in general, and that's another indirect measure, I believe. Okay, where do we get the data for this? So we're again looking at Los Angeles County, and we can get info on LIHTC from basically when it started up until today.
Sierra?
Am I back?
Yes, you're back now.
Perfect. Okay. So you can get info on LIHTC and you can get it at various spatial scales, and we could do it at the zip code, which is going to be my operating unit of geography. And then through access through the California Franchise Tax Board, I have access. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Sierra.
Okay, good. I turned off my video so that the audio doesn't come out. Right, I have access to household mobility data at the 5-digit and 9-digit level. And again, this is not, this report is not at all expressing any authorship or positions of the California Franchise Tax Board, or just using their data, thankfully. And then we're also going to control for rent. And so I have that using CoStar again at the 5-digit level for about 19 years. So how do we put this all together? Today, I will show you a zip code year panel that I construct that looks at these compositional changes. And I basically measured the effect of introducing a LIHTC on a zip code immediately and within a 5-year lag. And then in future work, or perhaps another presentation for Lusk, we'll look actually at the individual level mobility push factors, including LIHTC. Okay, so let's talk about the setup. 3 dependent variables. One is total population. Does LIHTC change the total number of households in an area, right? Up or down? Second one, and of more interest, is does LIHTC change the total number of wealthier households? And I'm using wealthy in a relative sense. And then again, I'm not being too restrictive. So about over 100,000 in the recent part of the panel. And again, using income data from HUD. And finally, the third one is the percentage of these wealthy households in a zip code. So that's the proportion. And I control for things like income, household size, age, total population, kind of demographic things in the zip code. Also the number of train stops, that's kind of in urban versus further suburban control. And then income band proportions and obviously year and zip code fixed effects. And in some specifications, I also control for the rent and rent per square foot, as well as the number of multifamily buildings, units, and the vacancy rate to see if, rental market also helps explain this. Let's look at a few descriptives, assuming I'm not running out of time. So one thing to note that at a county level, the total proportion of the wealthiest households in LA County, which is the black line, has actually been edging up since, in my time period. So that's interesting. So overall, number of wealthy, proportion of wealthy is going up. So perhaps, LIHTC is affecting it more, is not, but it's kind of a good backdrop. You may wonder, okay, well, how much LIHTC is actually going on in LA County? It's been pretty robust throughout my time span, about 30, an average of 20 to 30 new properties per year in the county, and which amounts to about an average of 2,000 new units online per year. So there is a steady flow. I'm not just looking for a needle in the haystack here. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what's, how many zip codes in years are we talking about? About 540 zip codes across 23 years. 600 of these zip code year combos had LIHTC put in place, right? So that's the incidence. And then, how do we compare the means between places that had LIHTC put in versus not? And in general, places with LIHTC are nearly double the population, have half the rate of the wealthy population, and are slightly lower rent and higher vacancy, but not by a lot. So that's kind of our descriptive view. And if you wanted to look slightly more visually about where LIHTC comes in and by how many over this time period, look at the black proportion on the right. This is the proportion of the wealthiest households by the number of LIHTCs placed in service over the panel. So 2 things you'll notice: the bottom bar, the black portion, is the largest. That's zip codes without any LIHTC, right? So that's about the 15 to 16 proportion of the wealthiest households. As you go up, that gets a lot smaller. And the top bar, I had to report, but that's only 2 zip codes that actually had 5 properties put in place over this time period. So overall, fewer and fewer wealthy households in places where more LIHTC goes in. Okay, but that doesn't really give us the impact of LIHTC. That's just the setup. So let's talk about that impact. So first, I want to show you the total, kind of the impact on the total population. And the punchline is, in zip codes that gain LIHTC properties, population goes up. The number of households go up. Anything you control for, it goes up. What's the magnitude of this up? Well, they gain about 120 households, not controlling for very much. If you control for the rental market, the increase is in about 75 households. And this is basically the year after LIHTC goes in. So it's possible that is actually all the residents of LIHTC move in and we gain by this much. So small but statistically significant changes in the total population. And if you do a 5-year lag, you can see that, hey, this actually goes on for some time, right? They continue gaining into the 5 years. So it's not like these LIHTC type neighborhoods are just losing population. And this investment is at least associated with increases. Now, more interestingly, what about the wealthy population, right? The number of households above 150% AMI. Well, here the impact is negative and statistically significant, at least in the simplest model that doesn't account for rents, right? So a LIHTC is associated with a 26 wealthy household decrease in the year after it gets put in. And over time, with lags, this is actually about 30 to 40 people per year decrease in the first 5 years of the wealthy household decrease. If you do put in housing stock variables and rent variables, this is no longer statistically significant, right? So there is something going on here between the market versus just the demographics, and I am still figuring out. But it's interesting that at least in the simpler models, there is a notable and statistically significant decrease in the wealthy population. And again, remember the baseline here was about 1,200 wealthy residents for LIHTC neighborhoods. So again, you're not having a huge percentage-wise impact, but about 2%, 3% per year. How about the proportion of wealthy households in a zip code? Well, nothing statistically significant, no real impact. So it may change kind of the count, but it doesn't really change the proportion of wealthy in a zip code. At least it's not big enough to do so. So those were the three main things I wanted to show. I know it's a short presentation, but just to wrap up, I find that LIHTC is associated with increases in population in the zip code after it gets put in, and with a decrease in the wealthy households, which is kind of confirming of the theory I put up earlier, but no change in income distribution, so not a big enough swing. However, there's also some evidence that the wealthy voting with their feet that we saw in some of those regressions actually mediated by the rental market, right? So there might be something else going on, and it's not just the LIHTC that's going in. And for next steps, right, like I said, I'm going to test individual level moves, and I'm also going to layer this with other affordable housing types, because perhaps there was already certain types of affordable housing before the LIHTC came in, such as project-based Section 8 or public housing or Hope 6, that people had already reacted to in their mobility choices. And so the LIHTC actually didn't do that much over the previous properties.
Thank you so much, Sieva. Very interesting presentation. So we have time for one, at most two questions.
Hey, Sieva. It's Gene speaking. Great presentation. Familiar material, interestingly. But I was just curious, the 120 to 200, the 120 household increase, does that correspond with the size of the buildings on average that are being put in by LIHTC?
Great question. I have a footnote on it, and I didn't have time to get to it. I did it on the per unit as well, to kind of try to control for exactly what you were trying to answer, exactly what you're asking. And I got that for about 100 unit building, the impact is an estimated increase of 77 versus 120, right? So there is something about building size that's in here as well. So it's not exactly one-to-one, but directionally it's in the same direction.
Okay. And then the second one was, if I remember correctly, Rebecca Diamond's paper on LIHTC stuff differentiates between the quality or / wealth of the neighborhood in which LIHTC was placed in. It doesn't look like you took that into consideration. But for example, I wonder, and this is somewhat a tangent, but I wonder if the decrease in wealthy households, for example, and corresponding, I'm guessing, decrease in rental markets, if those two kind of happen at the same time, right? You have wealthy households move out, and therefore landlords can't charge as high prices, vice versa. So they both directionally move in the same direction. Therefore, when you account for rental variables, I guess they become more or less confounded. But yeah, I guess those are two comments and questions.
Yeah, I think that just quickly, I am familiar with their papers. I think it's a great point. I did not split things into, you know, they basically find categories of neighborhoods, like you said, high income, low income, high white percentage, high African American percentage, etc. I didn't do that here, but I did, you know, I did as much as I could try to control for the rent, housing stock, and income proportion variables. So it is kind of endogenous in the model rather than kind of exogenous grouping. But it is a way to go.
Thank you very much, Sieva.